Hi, everyone. It's Lynn from Cotton Art Studio.
And hello, it's Brenda from Concrete Mount Scrapmore with Brenda. And today we're going to talk about quilt appraisals. This is
Yay!
something I have so many questions on, Lynn, and I'm so glad that you were willing to speak to both of our viewers about this topic.
I,
Okay, so
I think it's a really important topic. I mean, I think that we do this really great art form and we don't value it. And appraisal is a way to value what we do.
yes, yes, very much. There's so many. I have so many questions right now. But okay, so what? You're a certified quilt appraiser.
Mhm.
What made you become that? Like, what was your driving force? What was your reason? Or
Well, when I first started quilting, I joined a guild, as you do.
yeah,
And so there was a sort of, and I was overwhelmed by the amount of talent in the guild. And I was brand new and, didn't think I could do some of the stuff that these people were doing, which was just incredible in my eyes. And so they happened to have an appraiser come and speak one month for a lecture. And they were talking about history, and I love history. And they were talking about, just exploring different, kind of a mystery, kind of figuring out what date this is and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, I can do that. I can do that. And at the time, I was working full time, and my husband didn't have as much vacation time as I did. So I was looking for a place to go and spend vacation on something that I wanted to do because he didn't have the time off. So I went to Paducah and found that you could take appraisal classes, and went to Paducah to the AQS show one year and took appraisal classes. And that was my vacation.
well, yeah. You got to follow your passions, right? I mean, and just wing it. Let's go, right? But
Well, and it was something like I knew he wasn't going to go do or something, and I have family kind of close to the area. So it was kind of an excuse to go see my family and go find out more about quilts. And it just worked out well.
okay, I guess my first question to you. Now I know you probably got a big long talk, and we haven't talked about what questions I'm asking or
Oh,
anything. But
no. Yeah.
what are appraisals used for?
Okay.
Like,
A couple of things. First, insurance. If something happened to your quilt, you have an appraisal, somebody is documented and say, this is what it is worth. Now, in the States, I don't know about other countries, but in the States, insurance companies will not give you the valued worth of your quilted items after they are 7 years old because they see them as being used and they diminish in value.
right?
Now, so if they give you any money for, let's say, unfortunately, your house burns down and you have all these quilts, if you don't have appraisals on them, then you can say, I have all these quilts, but the insurance company is going to go, well, if they're over 7 years old, we don't have any money for that. Or at the most, they'll give you $100 to go buy a quilt at, a big box store or something, which we all know, there's not a quilt in my collection that I've done or that are older that's worth more than $100. So
Yeah, I just some raw materials alone. I was pricing out a project for a girlfriend. And this was before the price of cotton went up in Canada. It was $663 just for raw materials, not a cent for my time. And I was like,
right.
wow,
So
yeah,
insurance is one reason. The second reason is if you were selling this at market cost. So you're a quilt artist and you sell your work, you may need an appraisal for market value. I don't see those as very often. I rarely do those. I've worked with, there's a couple of artists around here and I know what they sell their quilts for. So usually it's kind of in that area of what they're selling their quilts for. And these are art quilters. And then the third reason that you would have an appraisal done is donation. So if I'm donating to a charity, a quilted work, then I would get an appraisal done for that donation. Now, the thing with that is, at least in the States, and it's probably true in other countries as well, you cannot deduct from your taxes in the States any amount of time that you put into the quilt. So for example, you know, what you were talking about, like there's $600 in material, but my
Yep.
time is worth, you know, $20 an hour or whatever. And it took me 100 hours to do this, then none of that is deductible for a donation. You can only deduct what it cost you. So the $600 for the materials. And then if you had it quilted by somebody else, then the cost of that quilting, that would be a part of your donation for your tax deduction. So that's a little bit, definitely work with your local quilt appraiser if you have a donation that you want to give to somebody. The way to look at that a little bit different though is if you give it to your son and your son donates it, he can take the whole cost off because he didn't do anything, right? So
Okay.
you know, think about how you're doing it too. But if you had your hand in it, you cannot take your time costs for a donation.
Yeah, see, here in Canada, what we do here is a lot of the guilds, they'll run the community service, right? And they'll organize, you know, charity quilts to be given to X organization. If the quilter gives directly to the X organization, they would get a charitable donation receipt based on value that is, you know, kind of a fix. Everybody gets $100 for every quilt and that's it, right? They don't do any like fancy appraisals. But if you give to the guild and then they give to the charity, you get nothing, right? So, and the other part of the argument,
and that would be true here as well.
Yeah, the other part of the argument here in Canada is what's the difference between appraisals and fair market value?
Okay.
Because fair market value and appraisals sometimes are quite a bit different.
Well, all right. So there's two different kinds of value that when I look at an appraisal that determine the value of the quilt. One is reconstruction and two is fair market value. Now, 90% of the time, the fair market value of a quilt is if I'm applying that to a quilt, it's vintage or antique because I can't recreate that. I do not have the fabric from 1930 to recreate this grandmother's flower garden that's in front of me. So that's fair market value means what are grandmother's flower garden quilts from the 1930s being sold for in my area? That's the fair market value in my area.
Right.
And it has to be sold by an educated buyer and an educated seller. So if you go to a rummage sale at somebody or a garage sale at somebody's house and you find this, you know, $10 quilt, you win, yay. But I can't use that as a fair market value because the seller was not knowledgeable. Right. So everything has to be equal. So it has to be, so fair market value is where I would look at vintage or antique quilts and what they're selling for, that condition, that pattern, and that age, right? So that's fair market value. Reconstruction is where you bring to me a brand new quilt, like the one behind you. Yeah. Look at it and I say, okay, this was newly made. What would it cost me to recreate this or reconstruct this quilt? And that's when I start looking at, oh, you've got $600 in fabric. Oh, it took you, let's say 40 hours to cut and piece that quilt at $20 an hour. Right. That's how much. Did it cost to do the binding? Right. So that is a reconstruction cost. And those can be much more expensive because I have to look at current price of fabric. Whereas fair market value, I couldn't look at the price of fabric because I can't get it. Right. I know there are vintage sellers out there that sell, 1930s fabric, but it's not readily available to me. You have to go to a specialty, store. So that can't be a reconstruction. That has to be a fair market value appraisal. Whereas reconstruction is like newly made quilts. And what I think most quilters don't realize is that newly made quilts are worth a lot of money.
Yeah, well, like this quilt behind me here, we're going to be running a sew along for this. This is a reconstruction of my grandmother's quilt, and her blocks finished at like 5 inches.
Ooh.
And
Those
I'm
aren't
like,
5-inch blocks behind you.
no, 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 no. A 5 inch block, my thumb would cover the little squares, right? I
Yeah.
mean, no, we're not doing a 5 inch square. No.
See, now that'd be up my alley. I'm like, let's do little teeny tiny.
Little tiny, I know. And some people really love that, the smaller the better, but
Yeah.
I think sometimes when you're like, well, I'm going to be teaching either both the hand and the sewing machine. So it's kind of like, okay, let's go with what your jam is.
Oh
So,
yeah, definitely, definitely. I don't think we're. I'm glad you're teaching some hand piecing. I need to do that because I really like hand piecing. So,
well, and I think there's a whole slow stitch movement happening now throughout North America and Europe, and it is soothing, right? I mean, I always try to do something at night once I finished, the craziness in my sewing room and running around, and after supper, I try and sit and do some hand sewing because it just relaxes me. So,
yeah,
yeah.
I do. My only problem with a hand sewing is you do have to prep it, and that takes organization. So, I prep little things that I carried around. I made a king size hand sewn hand piece quilt. I loved it, but I machine pieced it, and everybody got mad at me. And I was like, I'm good at long arming.
Yeah, well,
What am I
yeah.
gonna do?
Yeah,
I
go
don't
with
care that I hand piece the whole thing. I still long armed it.
do what you can do, right? Go hang out and do what you
Yeah.
can do. Now, since we're on this topic of hand sewing versus machine sewing, or hand quilting versus long arming or whatever, is there a difference in the appraisals when you're looking at that kind of thing? Like, are we, you know, there's a lot of like artists that are doing like some amazing free motion quilting with their long arms or with their domestic sewing machine, and then there's the hand quilting that's very basic and just basically follows the outline of the block, and it looks great, and that's all you have to worry about, right? So,
Well, okay. So it depends on what I'm doing. Like if we're looking at a vintage or antique quilt, it is what it is. So it's like this is hand pieced, but hand piecing something from the 1930s, totally normal. Like that would not be surprising that it was hand pieced. If I'm looking at something from the 1800s, hand pieced, I'm not shocked that I'm seeing a hand piece quilt. In fact, I'm more shocked if I'm seeing a machine piece quilt. And I'm
yes,
looking for reasons why it's not 1800s at that point,
right.
because that's not as common. Not that we didn't have sewing machines, we did, but you definitely were of a wealthier status before you were seeing those. So, like vintage or antique, it still looked like fair market, right? So I'm still looking at what that quilt would sell for at that time, that pattern at that age in that condition, still the same. Now when you get into interesting conversations is when you're doing reconstruction and you're looking at pricing what it would cost for reconstruction of a quilt, and the quilt in front of me, let's say, is hand pieced, hand quilted, very simple basic hand quilting. Well, honestly, there are not a ton of people doing hand quilting for other people, so
No.
it's harder to find that. Now, I will say that there are Amish country areas, at least in our country, where you can send a quilt top off, they will hand quilt it. So I have to look at what they're charging. Like,
Yes.
how much are they charging for a hand quilted quilt? All right. Now, if it's machine quilted, domestic or long arms, then you get into all the conversations of, well, is this a meander pattern that people are charging 2 cents a square inch? Then that's my cost of reconstruction. Is this a custom quilted, long armed? I mean, and it's got, I will tell you, some of my quilts have hundreds of hours of quilting in them.
Yes.
Then I'm looking at, well, what is the going rate for that kind of custom quilting? And I personally, when I custom quilt for people, I charge $35 an hour, 3 hour minimum. And I've got quilts that have 200 hours in them. So I have to look at the quilt and go, okay, because I know how long it takes to do certain things.
Right.
And I ask questions. What did somebody charge you? If you're bringing me a brand new quilt, I'm asking you, did you pay to have this done? If you did, how much did you pay? Because that's how much the cost that I'm going to calculate into what the insurance value is worth.
Wow. Yeah.
So it depends on what you're doing. It's all about the choices that you made to get this product in front of me.
Right. Huh. Wow. Yeah, because I know a lot of people are like, I have students that are asking, should I hand piece this, so should I hand quilt it? And it's like, well, will it add to the appraisal, or
it's not so much will it add to the appraisal for me, but it's your quilt and what do you want?
Well, yeah, that's right.
I mean, I don't look at my own work with, does this make it more valuable?
Right. Okay.
No, does it make me happy?
Yes.
That's what I'm interested in. So, and then as an appraisal, I just look at what you did and then that's how much it's worth.
Yes. Okay. So it's kind of not necessarily the hand versus a sewing machine. It's not, yeah, because I mean, you can have standing hand piecing and hand quilting too. That is just like,
oh yeah, and I look at that and I take that into consideration, especially if like I did a king size hand pieced quilt. It took me a year to do. It took me a year to hand piece that thing. Now, it didn't take me as long to quilt it, even though it's custom quilted, but I still know the amount of time that it took to get there.
Well, that sunflower quilt I did for my channel there in last winter, I'm still quilting it. I'm still hand quilting it. It's like,
oh yeah.
And there's so much brown. There's so much brown. I wasn't thinking. I mean, I like brown, but there's so much of it when you're hand quilting it, I know. And you can do a lot more things too with hand quilting. Like you can pull in a lot of fullness.
Oh yeah.
Hand quilting very easily, where with a domestic,
domestic may not, but in a long arm you can. Yeah, I've pulled in some fullness that it was like, ooh, okay. Okay. But I think you get better at putting on borders when you start doing your own quilting.
Yes. Well, I did when I put on the borders, everything matched up, and I was just like, but I still have some fullness. And I'm like, that's strange. Oh well, that's okay. Anyways, my last big question I want to ask you: what was your most interesting piece that you had the chance to appraise?
So there's a couple. One, there is I'm on the board of a local quilt museum in Carrollton, Georgia.
Right.
And they have a 1700s border per se quilt that was brought in by a random person that said, this has been under the car and we don't want it. Do y'all want it? So it's just like dropped off. And it is incredible. It's not in the best shape. There's some definitely fugitive issues with it in that it's super old. I mean, it's 1700s.
Yeah.
It was made from a certain chintz, and we were able to trace back that chintz, and it's incredible. The other one that is just incredible to me is I was at a show in North Georgia, and this lady brought in a suitcase and had a quilt in it. And I was busy with someone and I said, if you just want to leave that here, that's fine. I'm going to be in here and you can go look at the show and I'll, when we're done, you can come back and I'll do yours. Right. And she was like, oh, no, I do not leave this anywhere. And I was like, okay, no problem.
Yeah.
I was just trying to be helpful in that you're not dragging around the suitcase.
Yeah.
Right. So anyway, she comes back, she brings the suitcase, we open it up. It was, the provenance was, it was from a museum that went out of business and she bought it from the museum. And the museum's provenance was, It was a quilt that was made by soldiers that were hospitalized in Washington, D.C. area after the Civil War. And
Oh,
the entire quilt, front and back, was made from Union and Confederate uniforms. And and it was all hand pieced. It was the heaviest quilt I've ever had in my hand in my life. It was all hand pieced, of course. It was wool. It had gray and blue and some of the red wool that they used, and the yellow from the Confederate. So the
yeah.
yellow and gray were from the Confederate uniforms, and the blue and the red were from the Union uniforms.
Oh, wow.
And they had used, the story was, and the provenance that she showed me from the museum was that they were using quilting with these recovering soldiers as a way to, rehabilitate some of them who were bedridden and had some really, medical issues.
Right.
And it was one of the most fascinating pieces I've ever had the privilege of seeing in my life. I will never forget that quilt. It was gorgeous, but it was a different pattern of wool on both sides. And it was the heaviest quilt I've ever seen. It was probably at least a large queen, if not pushing a king size. Like it was like 100 by 100 and something.
Oh, wow.
Huge quilt, weighed a ton. And what made it so interesting from a fair market standpoint, and what made it difficult, I did a lot of research on this one, more than I do on other quilts, is that anytime you look at fair market, you look at collectability, like who would be interested in owning this, right?
Yeah.
And so with that specific quilt, you had Civil War. So anybody who's interested in collecting Civil War from the States, that foundation. Then you had the medical aspect, that it was a medical, it was done as a rehabilitation in a hospital. So that medical aspect made it so collectors of medical things. And then you had collectors of military. So
I think it's weird, just to interject. There's a post-traumatic stress syndrome, and they do bring in art to help those people that are going through post-traumatic stress. And they knew back then.
And they were doing it 150 years ago. Yeah.
I know.
So you've got medical, you've got military, you've got Civil War, and you've got quilters.
Yes.
Interested in this. So I ended up contacting some people who had more historical Civil War knowledge than I did, and talked to them. And it was one of those pieces that I will never forget. It was the most surprising thing. You're in a little quilt show in North Georgia, and all of a sudden you get this unbelievable, and it was perfect. It, like a lot of times when you're brought older stuff, you get into the question of, is this real? Am I looking at what I think I'm looking at? And then you look for reasons for it not to be real. Does this still match up to everything I know about the historical textile? And so it did. It was incredible, and just that was the cool quilt I've ever seen.
One of the things the questions that just popped in my head is, what about people who repair quilts? Like, there's some argument now too about leaving the holes and the rips and the tears and the wear marks versus fixing it to keep it vibrant and alive, and I'm like,
it's your quilt.
Yeah.
It's your quilt. How do you want to use this quilt? And if it's got a big hole in it and you just want to pack it up and store it in a cedar chest, good for you. But it's not going to be seen. It's not going to be used. It's your quilt. Now, is it one of those quilts that I always ask, like, what do you want to do with it? Like, why is this sentimental to you? Or did you just pick it up at a random, sale or something? Well, if it's sentimental because grandma made it and all the grandkids slept under it, and now there's, 10 great grandkids, and it's got this big hole in it, I'm always like, cut it up, frame it, little pieces of it, and give it to the 10 great grandkids that have something from their great grandmother that was made, that they have tangible, that there's no one person can't enjoy it anymore because there is a big hole in it. or
Right.
make teddy bears, or, little, find some way that you can share it among others. Now, do you do that with a pristine quilt? Probably not, but
Oh, yeah.
it's your quilt. How do you want it to preserve it and stuff? I get asked this a lot, especially with crazy quilts. We see a ton of crazy quilts, at least in this country. I see the two quilts I see most when I do an appraisal day is Grandmother's Flower Garden and a crazy quilt. So I'm seeing stuff from the 1930s all the time, and I'm seeing crazy quilts. And the reason I see so many crazy quilts is because they were a status and they weren't used.
Well, and the Victorian crazy quilts too, it was all about the fabrics and
Right.
the embroidery, and it was
a status. I
Yeah.
have money, I spent it on this, silk fabric. I have domestic skills. Here's my hand embroidery techniques so it showed off women's work. And it was not used. It was a throw that was on the back of the settee or a chair, and it wasn't used because it was made and it had these delicate fabrics in it. Well, they were folded up and put away, and we see a lot of them today. So they're not really rare. In fact, they're pretty common, but they're precious because they have so much work into them, and people have saved them because they were to be saved. So it's not one of those quilts that you see used all the time, and that's why we see so many of them.
Right, yeah. Well, they're like, for me, those quilts are just the textures. Like, you go from velveteen to silk to satin to that Wedgwood, the satin
Upholstery kind of stuff.
Yeah, and it's just like, oh my gosh, yeah, they're just gorgeous.
I guess they're like the first fidget quilts. You know what I mean? With all the
the first style quilts, yeah.
They're gorgeous and I love them. I have made my own version of a crazy quilt that I showed you, and wrote a pattern for that just because I wanted to honor the heritage of that.
Right. Well, yeah. And I mean, they're all beautiful. They're all beautiful in their own way.
Yeah. The ones that are just fascinate me are the ones that have the painted, like there'll be ribbons that are painted. And then I like how they've hidden stuff in from, spider webs to little ladybugs or a flower or bouquet or nosegay or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Very cool. Very cool indeed. Well, Lynn, I want to thank you for talking to us about quilt appraisals. I was so glad that we got the chance to connect here today and do our little chat. It was wonderful and very informative. Very informative.
Okay, two things I want to leave the viewers with. First, label your quilts.
Oh yes.
Label your quilts, because that makes my job easier. And put when you made it, who you made it for, and don't just put mom. Put her name, because we all have moms.
Yes.
Put her name or who it was and who made it, their name, not daughter or favored son or whatever. Put the name. And then if it's for a special occasion, like this was made for their wedding, or this was made for their birthday, or this was made for their graduation from college, or whatever. Label, number one. And number two, get your quilt appraised.
Yes.
They're valuable.
Now, if viewers on my channel have more questions they want to ask you about quilt appraisals, can you get back to them, or do they need to go to your channel and ask you there?
Well, I won't see it if it's on your channel, so just go to my channel and just comment on the video and I'll answer.
Yeah. Okay, very cool. Okay, Lynn, you take care. All right, everybody have a wonderful week. Okay, bye.
Bye. Thanks, Brenda.